This is the Nintendo Switch 2, Nintendo's next console that just came out. And since I have it right here, I want to try and answer the question that's been on everyone's mind since it was announced. Will the Nintendo Switch 2 fail? I have been putting a lot of thought into this question, and to be honest, I'm a little worried. A lot of people are very angry at Nintendo for how they are releasing this console. But then again, the Nintendo Switch 1 is almost the best-selling console of all time. So a lot of people think that the Nintendo Switch 2 could either be a massive failure, or maybe Nintendo's greatest ever success. Nintendo has tried to make sequels to consoles in the past, and they have all historically done much worse than the original console. The Game Boy Advance only got 68% of the sales of the Game Boy. The 3DS had 48% of the sales of the DS, and worst of all, the Wii U only got 12% of the sales of the Wii. And so, one would think that the same thing might happen to the Switch 2. There is one glaring difference between the Switch 2 and these other consoles, however. Simply because of the name. The name Nintendo Switch 2 describes exactly what the console is supposed to be. As I've talked about before, the names of the previous consoles might have made people think that they were just special versions of the original console and not a completely new one. I believe that adding a 2 is in fact the best way to market this new console. It shows that it is something new and exciting, a different console that has more games and more powerful hardware. Sometimes the most obvious answers are the ones that succeed the most, and we already know that simply putting a 2 onto the next console is an effective way to market one, because the PlayStation 2 is the greatest selling console of all time. But I don't think the same thing will happen to the Switch 2. The Nintendo Switch 1 has already gotten 150 million sales over its lifetime, making it the second best-selling console in history. To make that happen again would be a miracle. The PlayStation 2 succeeded so much because it doubled as a DVD player, meaning that it had uses for people who didn't even play video games. The Switch 2, on the other hand, serves the exact same purpose as the original Switch. For example, one of the biggest selling points of the Nintendo Switch 1 was the fact that thousands of indie games could be played on the go. But most indie games don't need more powerful hardware than the Switch 1. And since most people who would be interested in that already have the Switch 1, Nintendo may be missing out on a huge amount of customers that see no reason to buy another Switch. But the Nintendo Switch 1 has been showing its age for a long time now. Not only is it extremely weak compared to its competitors, but it also has extreme issues that almost ruin the console. For example, constant lag, bad graphics on first-party games, and maybe worst of all, Joy-Con drift. There may be a lot of people who want a Switch 2 just to get an upgrade that doesn't have these issues. However, Nintendo also benefited a lot from the timing of the Switch 1. The fact that Animal Crossing was released right at the beginning of the pandemic meant that millions of casual gamers had nothing to do but play games, bringing in an immense amount of sales. Unless something like that were to happen again, Nintendo won't be able to capture this market, and the only way that they would be able to capture the same amount of people is through their marketing. Comparing what we've already seen from the Switch 2 to the ads from the Wii U, this is a huge improvement. But these ads are still not great. The dialogue seems really cheesy and unrealistic, but at least it's not incredibly cringe, it's just very boring and corporate. Unlike the Wii U, people will be able to respect the Switch 2 as not just a console for children, but truly one for everyone, even if its marketing isn't amazing. However, I have seen some people worrying that the Nintendo Switch 2 is not flashy enough to attract attention. They say that it doesn't have enough new features, and so no one will buy it, but I disagree. The features on the Switch 2 are definitely lackluster, but to be honest, I don't think that adding drastically different new features to the Switch 2 is gonna make the console succeed. In fact, I think that very different features might have put Nintendo in trouble. When the Wii U tried to innovate upon the Wii by adding a gamepad, it became a gimmick that games struggled to find a good use for. And when people tried to use the 3D feature on the 3DS, they quickly got tired of it. The PS5 hasn't added that many new features from the PS4, yet it has done amazingly. I think that Nintendo doesn't need to rely on useless gimmicks like the gamepad or 3D to advertise their console. Simply by creating a better, more powerful console with fun games will give it the sales it needs. And Nintendo might finally be a stable company upon each new generation of console. But at the end of the day, the games are probably always going to be the most important factor for the Switch 2's success. And Nintendo has revealed a lot of brand new games heading onto the Switch 2. So let's talk about the most important one, Mario Kart World. I think it's pretty safe to say that this is going to be the best-selling game on the Switch 2. Not only is it a pack-in title that's a better deal, but it's also a Mario Kart game. And need I remind you that Mario Kart 8 Deluxe is the 4th best-selling game of all time. This was the best decision to ensure that the Nintendo Switch 2 will be a success. Everyone has played Mario Kart, and this is the biggest Mario Kart game ever. So not only does Nintendo have a few killer first-party games coming out, but Nintendo has finally managed to get third-party AAA games onto their system. Games like Elden Ring, Cyberpunk, and even a brand new Switch exclusive FromSoft game are actually able to run on the Switch 2. Now, most hardcore gamers will probably continue to play these games on Xbox, PS5, or PC to get the best graphics and frame rate. But for casual gamers, they're not going to know the difference between the Switch 2 version and the better versions. They would probably rather buy the game for the console that they already have, instead of buying an even more expensive console to play it. So Nintendo will finally be able to take some of the sales away from Sony and Microsoft, and absorb these somewhat casual gamers into the Nintendo empire. Now, I don't think that this is necessarily a good thing, but it will certainly drive more sales for the Nintendo Switch 2. And there are so many huge Nintendo franchises that Nintendo has yet to announce for the system, which is a really good sign for the Switch 2's life cycle. From Super Smash Bros. To Mario to Animal Crossing to Zelda, Pokemon, and Splatoon, they'll have a steady stream of massive games giving a huge boost to the Switch 2 over the next 5 years. They're not going to run out of games like the Wii U did. Nintendo will constantly be able to tap into these huge audiences, receiving a steady stream of fans entering the Switch 2 community every few months. Wow, with all these incredible things promoting the sales of the Switch 2, I'm sure that this console will be a success. In fact, it might be the best-selling console of all time. Oh my god, I can't believe Nintendo has done it again. Wow. And then there's the price. $80 for games and $450 for the console. Not to mention the unending amount of accessories that Nintendo expects us to buy on top of that. And it's not only in the United States. It's really quite hard to say how the price of the Switch 2 might affect the sales of the Switch. Obviously, there are many people who are definitely not going to buy the Switch 2 because of these extremely high prices. But there are also millions of fans who will buy anything from Nintendo, no matter the cost. And in this economy, it's hard to predict how this could change in a year, in a few months, or even next week. But I'm gonna make a prediction anyways. No, the Nintendo Switch 2 is not going to fail. In fact, I believe it will be a success. But I don't think it will be as successful as the Switch 1. So, with all that being said, I believe the Nintendo Switch 2 will end its lifespan with 90 million sales. I know, a lot of people are gonna think I'm stupid for this, either thinking that this is way too high, or maybe even way too low. And all odds are that I'm probably wrong. But let's take into consideration the pros and cons list. On one hand, you can argue that the Switch 2 will succeed because everyone knows what it is, Mario Kart World will drive its sales, and that Nintendo is possibly at the most powerful point it has ever been. But on the other hand, Nintendo's sequels always do worse, It has high prices, and the world has volatile economic conditions. But no matter how you see it, the Nintendo Switch 2 is in for a wild ride over the next 5 to 8 years, and I am certainly excited, and maybe a little worried, to see how it goes. Thanks for watching, see you next time.